This is the very last photograph I ever took of Bruno. If you look closely, you'll notice his face had turned almost completely white. His eyes, once so bright with endless curiosity, had become cloudy with age. His steps were slower. His ears no longer stood up every time I called his name. But whenever he looked at me, I still saw the same little puppy, the one I met on a rainy night 13 years earlier. A puppy that no one wanted, a puppy that almost didn't survive. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had decided to keep walking that night. Maybe someone else would have found him, maybe no one would have. Life often changes because of one small decision, one step, one glance, one moment. For me, that moment came on a cold autumn evening. It had been raining for hours. The streets were almost empty. People hurried home with umbrellas held tightly above their heads. Cars splashed through puddles without slowing down. Everyone seemed to have somewhere important to be. Everyone, except one tiny soul. As I walked past an old grocery store, I heard something. At first, I thought it was the wind. Then I heard it again, a tiny cry, so soft. I almost missed it. I stopped, looked around. Nothing. Another little whimper echoed through the rain. This time, I followed the sound. Hidden beside a rusty dumpster was an old cardboard box. Its sides had collapsed from the rain. Inside, curled into the smallest ball imaginable, was a tiny golden retriever puppy. He couldn't have been more than 6 weeks old. His fur was soaked. His little body trembled uncontrollably. His ribs showed through his thin coat. He looked exhausted, hungry, cold, and completely alone. I looked around, expecting someone to come looking for him. Nobody came. There wasn't a collar, no blanket, no food, no note, just a frightened puppy, trying his best to stay alive. I remember telling myself, someone else will help. I took 2 steps away. Then, I heard another tiny cry behind me. I stopped again. To this day, I still believe that single sound changed both of our lives forever. When I turned around, our eyes met for the very first time. He didn't bark. He didn't run. He simply stared at me. Not with fear, not with anger, but with hope. The kind of hope that only exists when you have absolutely nothing left to lose. I knelt beside the box, slowly reached out my hand. For a second, he hesitated. Then his tiny wet nose touched my fingers. His little tail moved. Just once, then again. Even after everything he'd been through, he still trusted people. That broke my heart. I wrapped him inside my jacket. His whole body fit comfortably against my chest. I could feel his tiny heartbeat racing. As I walked home through the rain, he slowly stopped shaking. Within minutes, he had fallen asleep, safe, warm, maybe for the first time in days. That was the night. My life quietly changed forever. The next morning, the house felt different. Not because anything had changed, but because there was now another heartbeat inside it. I placed him on an old towel in the kitchen. He looked around carefully. Every chair, every wall, every window, everything was new, everything was strange. Yet somehow, he already acted as if he belonged there. The veterinarian estimated he was about 6 weeks old, malnourished, dehydrated, covered in fleas, but otherwise healthy enough to recover. The doctor smiled. He has a strong heart. Looking back now, I think those words described much more than his health. They described his entire life. The drive home was quiet. He sat on my lap, staring out the window with wide, curious eyes. Every passing tree, every bird, every person, everything fascinated him. It was as if the world was finally introducing itself. Finding the perfect name wasn't easy. I tried dozens. None of them felt right. Until I remembered my grandfather. He always believed dogs understood human emotions better than people ever could. His name was Bruno. So, this little puppy became Bruno too. The first night at home, he refused to sleep alone. Every time I placed him in his new bed, he whimpered. So I sat on the couch, pulled a blanket over us, and held him against my chest. The moment he heard my heartbeat, he relaxed. Within seconds, he was asleep. That tiny puppy already believed he was safe. I didn't realize it then, but from that night forward, I would never truly be alone again. Part 2. Growing together. The first few weeks were absolute chaos. Bruno had endless energy. He treated every object in the house as if it had personally challenged him. Shoes disappeared, socks became toys, blankets became mountains. My favorite cushion survived exactly 3 days before fluffy white stuffing floated through the living room like fresh snow. I wanted to be angry. Instead, I laughed. Because every guilty face he made lasted only a few seconds before his wagging tail convinced me to forgive him. Bruno had a habit that never changed. Every single morning, he reached the front door before I did. Long before my alarm rang, he was already waiting, tail wagging, eyes shining, ready for another adventure. It didn't matter if we walked for 10 minutes or 2 hours. To him, every walk was the greatest journey ever imagined. The same park, the same trees, the same path. Yet somehow, he explored it like it was brand new every single day. He chased butterflies with complete determination. He barked at squirrels that ignored him. He proudly carried sticks far bigger than himself, and every few minutes, he would stop, turn around, and make sure I was still following, as if he was the one taking care of me. People in the neighborhood quickly learned his name. Children ran toward him after school. Older neighbors greeted him before greeting me. Delivery drivers smiled whenever they saw his golden tail racing across the yard. Bruno never met a stranger, only future friends. He learned commands surprisingly fast. Sit, stay, shake, lie down, come. But the greatest thing he ever learned required no training at all. He learned how to listen, not to words, to feelings. Whenever I had a difficult day, he somehow knew before I even opened the front door. He never barked, never demanded attention. He simply walked over, rested his head gently against my knee, and stayed there. Sometimes, that silent comfort meant more than any conversation ever could. Life moved forward, seasons changed, spring flowers bloomed, summer mornings stretched into long evenings. Autumn covered the sidewalks with golden leaves. Winter wrapped the neighborhood in quiet snow. Through every season, Bruno remained the one constant in my life. There were birthdays, new jobs, late-night movies, weekend road trips, camping beneath thousands of stars, countless photographs, countless memories. Every single one included Bruno. Years passed so naturally. I barely noticed the little puppy disappearing. One day, I looked at him and realized he wasn't a puppy anymore. He had become a magnificent golden retriever, strong, confident, gentle, and somehow it still convinced he could fit comfortably on my lap. Then life surprised me again. I fell in love. I worried how Bruno would react. Would he become jealous, protective, distant? Instead, the moment they met, Bruno walked over calmly, leaned against him, and accepted him as family. Just like that. No questions asked. That was Bruno. He never judged anyone by words, only by kindness. When we got married, Bruno proudly attended the ceremony wearing a little blue bow tie. He hated every second of wearing it. The photographs tell the whole story. Everyone smiled. Bruno looked deeply offended. It became one of our favorite family jokes. A few years later, our daughter was born. Many people warned us to be careful introducing a baby to a large dog. They didn't know Bruno. The first time he saw her, he walked over quietly, sniffed her tiny blanket, sat beside the crib, and from that moment on, he decided protecting her was his new job. He never left her side. He watched every nap, every crawl, every first step. When she cried, he was always the first to reach her room. Long before we did, our little family had grown, and at the center of it all was the puppy that nobody wanted. None of us knew. That time was already moving far faster than we realized. Part 3. When time began to win. Nobody tells you the exact day your best friend starts growing old. There isn't a warning, no announcement, no dramatic moment. It happens quietly, one ordinary day at a time. At first, I barely noticed. Bruno still greeted me every morning. His tail still wagged with the same excitement. He still insisted on carrying his favorite tennis ball everywhere he went. But little things began to change. He no longer sprinted across the yard. Instead, he trotted. Then, he walked. Our long adventures became shorter. The mountain trails we once explored turned into peaceful strolls around the neighborhood. The endless games of fetch became just a few gentle throws before he happily lay down in the grass, panting with a smile that somehow still looked exactly like the puppy I had rescued years ago. One afternoon, we stopped at our favorite park. Bruno walked toward the lake where he used to leap fearlessly into the water. This time, he simply stood there, watching the gentle ripples, feeling the breeze. He didn't need to chase the ducks anymore. He seemed content just watching them. For the first time, I realized he wasn't changing because he wanted to. His body simply couldn't keep up with his heart anymore. That realization hurt more than I expected. The gray hairs arrived slowly. At first, just a few around his chin, then around his eyes. Within a year, his bright golden face had become dusted with silver. People would stop us during our walks. What a beautiful old dog. I smiled every time they said it. But inside, I wished they hadn't used the word old, because saying it out loud somehow made it real. Bruno's hearing began to fade. Sometimes I'd call his name, and he wouldn't turn around. Instead of feeling frustrated, I walked closer, touched his shoulder gently. The moment he saw me, his entire body lit up with happiness. His tail wagged just as wildly as it had 13 years earlier, as if to say, "I knew you'd come." The stairs became difficult. Every evening, he paused at the bottom, looking up, thinking about the effort. One night, without saying a word, I bent down and lifted him into my arms. He looked embarrassed, almost apologetic. I laughed softly. "Do you remember," I whispered, "when you carried me through my hardest days? You never complained. So now, it's my turn." From that evening on, whenever he struggled, I carried him. Not because he couldn't do it, but because he didn't have to anymore. He had already spent his whole life taking care of us. Our daughter had grown into a cheerful little girl. Every afternoon after school, she sat beside Bruno on the porch. She talked about everything: her teachers, her friends, her dreams, the cartoons she watched, the games she played. Bruno listened with complete attention, never interrupting, never getting bored, occasionally tilting his head as though every word was the most important story he'd ever heard. Sometimes I wondered if children and dogs shared a language adults could no longer understand. One evening, my daughter asked me something I wasn't prepared to answer. "Dad, will Bruno always be here?" The question froze me. I looked toward Bruno. He was asleep beneath the old oak tree, the same tree where he had chased butterflies as a puppy, the same tree where he'd spent countless summer afternoons. I wanted to say yes, more than anything. I wanted to promise her that nothing would ever change, but I couldn't. Instead, I hugged her tightly and said, "We should make every day with him a special one." She nodded, not fully understanding. Children rarely think about time. They believe the people they love will always be there. I used to believe that too. Winter arrived earlier than usual. The mornings became colder, the nights became longer. One icy morning, something happened that had never happened before. I woke up, walked toward the front door, and Bruno wasn't waiting there. For 13 years, he had greeted me every single morning, without fail. This morning, he was still lying peacefully in his bed. I knelt beside him. His eyes slowly opened. He wagged his tail, but he didn't stand. Something inside me knew. The day I had always feared was finally approaching. The veterinarian greeted us with a gentle smile. He had known Bruno almost his entire life. He knelt down, scratched behind Bruno's ears, and quietly listened to his heartbeat. The room felt impossibly silent. Finally, he looked at me. His voice was soft. His heart is getting tired. He isn't in pain. But he's telling us his journey is almost over. Those words echoed in my mind long after we left the clinic. Almost over. How could 13 years feel like only yesterday? Instead of counting the days we had left, we decided to fill every one of them with